Alright, so a video that I've kind of wanted to make over the last few weeks, but actually in the last few days there have been a couple of Reddit posts that made me think, oh, this is actually pretty interesting to read and talk about, and now is possibly a good time to really share it with you guys. So it's specifically about esports in Age of Empires 4. Now I know it's a very niche topic, for all the campaign enjoyers, all the custom lobby enjoyers, the nomad players. This is probably not too relevant, but it's still interesting to talk about because it is a big part of the Age of Empires 4 scene. So there are two Reddit posts that I wanted to read through and talk about today, and one is from, well, it's a translation of Vortix's explanation for why he quit Age of Empires 4, and the second Reddit post is a post from EGCTV. I don't think there's any argument about it. They are the biggest tournament hosts for Age of Empires 4. Of course, we've got plenty of others as well. Rising Empires and Steel Series have been getting involved as well recently, which is fantastic to see, and of course then there's Red Bull. But, EGCTV has been there right from the beginning and have been sort of the spine, if you will, for Age of Empires 4 esports, so we'll take a look at that as well. Let's start with Vortix's translated explanation on why he quit Age of Empires 4, which I think is actually revealing quite a few interesting things, especially about RTSs in general, but also about Age of Empires 4 and how it's different from other types of RTS. So let's get right into it. Hello everyone, while I leave in the background footage from one of my last Age of Empires 4 games, I wanted to make a video, hopefully not too long, explaining a bit about why I decided to leave the game. As many of you know, I am playing Stormgate, a game I'm streaming practically every day. So just to let you guys know, in the background of this video, I will be leaving footage of one of the casted games I've recently gone through, which you might find just a bit of a background noise interesting. But specifically in this paragraph, not too much to talk about, but it clearly shows he's left Age of Empires 4 and is moving on to Stormgate, which is streaming practically every day. Which is, each to their own. Obviously, Stormgate is seemingly more appealing to him right now, and I believe he's actually making good progress in terms of his stream numbers and the popularity of it. So big credit to him for achieving that. Very, very exciting, I'm sure, and obviously it's a big positive step in his move for that game. Now the question is why has he left Age of Empires 4, and then why has he moved to Stormgate, which of course is going to be the topic of the rest of this post. So if you're interested, I recommend you check out my Twitch. Also the latest videos and future uploads will be mainly about Stormgate. The thing is, I keep encountering a lot of people asking me in the live streams and videos why I've quit Age of Empires 4, and if I'm going back to it, etc. Now the next two paragraphs doesn't really add too much, just explains that he's been asked about this issue quite a bit and this is why he's making the video. First of all, to understand why I quit Age of Empires 4, you need to understand my background in RTS games. A lot of you have been playing Age of Empires 4 your whole lives, starting with Age of Empires 3, 2 or even 1. Maybe even Age of Mythology. But for me, Age of Empires 4 is the first game in the series that I've competed in. I've been competing in esports for over 15 years, but never in Age of Empires before. My background is mostly in fast-paced dynamic RTS games from Blizzard, StarCraft, Warcraft, and so on. So the background of his RTS career has mostly been in fast-paced dynamic RTS games, which I think already gives you a bit of a leaning into why he's left Age of Empires 4. So, how did he actually end up in Age of Empires 4? To understand why he's leaving, this is important. Age of Empires 4 was released at a time when I had already stopped competing. I had been playing some Warcraft 3 Reforged because I love that game. It's my favourite RTS of all time. And when the Reforged circuit was cancelled, I decided to quit. At that point, I had been playing Age of Empires 2 casually, reached a decent level, around top 190 in the world, but just for fun. Then came Age of Empires 4, the beta invite. And I have to confess, I didn't like Age of Empires 4 at first, but I saw it as an opportunity to potentially continue competing. At least until a new RTS from Blizzard came out, which, let's be real, isn't happening. So Age of Empires 4 was a big game, and it seemed like it could have a big esports scene. Now this paragraph, I think, is actually quite critical. I think a lot of people felt this way, coming in from various RTS genres. I felt like Age of Empires 4 was certainly coming at a time where it actually could have united lots of the different sub-genres of RTS games all together. Now, yeah, we all kind of know how it was on release of Age of Empires 4, at least in terms of specifically commenting on 1v1 gameplay in the competitive scene. It wasn't all that great. We didn't have hotkeys or customizable hotkeys and stuff like that. Some really basic functionality, or what we would, see as basic, just wasn't there. And A lot of bugs were there, and a lot of people lost interest very, very quickly. And it's actually very difficult to recover from an initial bad experience that someone has with the game. People tend not to come back. It has to take something huge for someone to decide to come back to a game that they didn't really quite click with. So the launch was a bit weird. It wasn't sort of a... I mean, I guess it depends how you consider a fully fleshed out game, but from the 1v1 multiplayer experience, it didn't really seem so. Now, whether that matters for Age of Empires 4 and how big the game is and the franchise is to them, you never really know. I mean, it's a big franchise. Ultimately, they were always going to iterate on the game and get it to a solid state and a solid player base. That's just the benefit of having, the name behind you in a big franchise. But from the initial point of view of grouping up plenty of different RTS subgenres together to unite them, Age of Empires 4 had a real opportunity to do that. And I'm not sure that it really delivered. Bearing that in mind, still clearly players like Vortix did jump on the bandwagon, despite Age of Empires 4, the type of game that it is, wasn't necessarily appealing. So we already know the hearts and minds of Vortix and likely players like him that kind of joined Age of Empires 4 because of a lack of an alternative, which is a big reason why, it could have united a lot of people. Either way, he goes on to say that Age of Empires 4 is the first game that I joined directly for the competitive scene, not because I loved it. I didn't like it initially, but I grew to enjoy it eventually. Don't think I'm one of those who now hates it and says it's a bad game. No. I ended up liking Age of Empires 4, but it wasn't love at first sight. I kept playing because I did pretty well in the beta, finishing top 2 on the internal ladder. Then the official leaderboard came out, and well, things worked out for me. Many aspects of Age of Empires 4 started to really frustrate me. Anyone who has followed my streams probably knows what I'm talking about. Basically, I feel that Age of Empires 4 is, well, why has it stalled? It has several serious design flaws. One of them is the siege design. It's absurd that the best counter to siege units is other siege units. This leads to late game scenarios where both players are just spamming siege, which is really common in Age of Empires 4. It's a major design flaw. Thankfully, it's mostly confined to late game now, because in earlier stages like Feudal Age, it used to be even worse. It's not fun watching endless siege spam. Now, I don't know, because in earlier stages like Feudal Age, I don't know if that's meant to be Castle Age, because I don't think there really ever was siege in Feudal Age. Sure, there's battering rams, but I don't think that really counts. I mean, if anything, battering ram is the opposite of what the complaint is here, where battering rams is actually kind of aggressive, right? So I guess the issue with siege is some of its relevance is probably mostly orientated about taking down structures, like trebuchets, bombards in late game. Earlier than that, the mangonel was quite critical, right, to deal with mass ranged units. I feel like that's the reason why siege is really there, at least it is for Age of Empires 2. Now, there's two ways to think about it. Mangonels, the biggest problem for them is when they group up together and they just got a meat shield in front of them. Like, sometimes it's very hard to get on top of it. So, I guess what he's saying here really, the only way to deal with mangonels is, well, springalds, right? And then the only way to deal with springalds is your own springalds. So the biggest problem is how to deal with siege and the fact that you can't deal with siege other than with anything but siege. We have been talking about it in certain civilizations, for example, the Byzantines having the trample ability with their cavalry, their beautiful cataphracts, and being able to get on top of siege. So I think Vortix does make a good point here that it is annoying that you have siege which can only be dealt with by other siege. But yeah, I mean, I guess certain changes probably does have to be made there. I do agree this is kind of an issue. There's probably certain things you can change, like potentially for melee units, they could have a +2 range against specifically just siege units. So they could kind of attack siege units through a front line of units. Probably a bit hard to do, and it's probably a bit of a weird change. The only other thing I can think about is maybe increasing the supply of siege engines. That way you can afford less units to protect them. I'm not going to pretend to know I know the answer. I'm not particularly great with balance and stuff like that. But there is certainly an issue there that's Vortix has brought up. But beyond that, the biggest problem with Age of Empires 4 for me, and I think for most viewers, and why it fails to take off competitively, is that they've minimized the micro mechanics to a point where it lacks any spectacle. I don't care about spectacle personally, but if I want to compete, I just want there to be skill differentiation between the players. But in Age of Empires 4, there is very little of that. They've simplified the micro so much that most games are won purely on decision making. It's not bad for decisions to matter, like they do in Aoe4, But Aoe4, along with great decision making, also has excellent and intricate micro mechanics, which Age of Empires 4 lacks. So, I mean, with all of this, I don't necessarily disagree. I think that the micro focus on Age of Empires 4 is a lot less than many RTS games, and the thing about that though, that's not necessarily a bad thing or a wrong thing as such. It's just different from maybe what Vortix likes and what many people like, and to be honest, in many ways that I like to play. But personally, for me as a caster, one of the reasons why I do love watching Age of Empires 4 is not because of the micro stuff. There is micro, to be fair, but maybe not as prominent as many other games. But the biggest thing for Age of Empires 4 and what it does really well, and the Age of Empires strategy games in total in the franchise, is that it is actually very much focused on, well, strategy, decision making. So in real-time strategy, there's, well, two components to it, right? There's strategy and then there's the real-time aspect of it. And micro certainly falls under the real-time aspect of it, whereas strategy is the decision making. I mean, when you put it in context, a lot of RTS games only have 2 resources. That's what Blizzard-style RTS games have. Age of Empires 4 has 4, so you can already see right from the bat, just from the way it's designed based on a macro decision-making kind of model. And I think it's a good thing because it's an option. For example, if that wasn't the case, then, well, all RTSs will be the same. They wouldn't be focused on, well, they'd just be focused on the micro mechanics. So I think it's a spectrum, right? So Age of Empires 4 certainly is on the sort of the end scale of the spectrum when it comes to the focus on macro, and then you've got Blizzard style RTS more focused on the micro. And it's understandable that Vortix may not feel too keen on the way that Age of Empires 4 is, you know, structured and you know, set at. And that's completely valid. Whether that makes it a bad game or not, I don't think it does. It just makes it a very different game. There are 2 basic micro mechanics in any RTS, no matter what, kiting and targeting. But on top of that, you need to build something interesting for the viewer to watch. In Aoe4, for example, there's the mechanic of dodging arrows. In StarCraft, you have tons of abilities. And Warcraft, I won't even get started because you have 3 heroes per race with 4 abilities each. Aoe4 literally has nothing but kiting and targeting. No other micro mechanics whatsoever. When you make a game like that and remove all the visual flair, ... Well, I mean, the thing is that people watch Age of Empires franchise games for a totally different reason. I think really people watch Age of Empires franchise games more for the decision making that's happening and what that ends up resulting in. I mean, for me personally, I watch Age of Empires 4 games for the strategies primarily, and not so much sort of the micromanaging of certain units, which is pretty cool when it's there, but it's certainly not the main focus. And so yeah, I feel like it's a total different kettle of fish. And not all RTS games are the same, right? I can imagine RTS games having a much more leaning towards the micro aspect of things where it matters a lot more. For example, you know, StarCraft. I think Age of Empires 2 is probably in between Age of Empires 4 and the StarCraft type RTS games. Even then, Age of Empires 2 is probably still a bit more on the strategy side of things. Either way, he goes on to say, well, think about it. Do you really like Age of Empires 4? Why does it have so few viewers? Because most people don't enjoy watching a glorified empire building simulator. And that's the vibe you get from many Age of Empires 4 games. You're not watching an esport, you're watching a guy sit in his base for 10 to 15 minutes pumping out units. Then they mass their armies and boom, that's it. For me, coming from other RTS games, it's incredibly boring. Static defenses are poorly designed, the stone walls, the keeps, it all seems geared towards a very slow defensive playstyle. Now, I wouldn't disagree with his analysis that it's geared towards a defensive playstyle, or at least compared to StarCraft. You know, StarCraft games can be, 5-10 minutes if you want them to. The issue is that it's just a whole different kettle of fish. It's, I think the esports scene being low in viewers is one thing to talk about, and then there's a type of game that it is. I don't think Age of Empires 4 is on its own in terms of low viewership numbers. I mean, sure, it's going through a bit of a rough patch, but I mean, ultimately you have to also think about what you're looking at. To build up a hardcore scene in terms of esports, you have to have many years, and that's why StarCraft and Age of Empires 2 have a pretty decent following on Twitch and decent viewership. And when you compare the longevity of those games, how long it's been out, compare that to Age of Empires 4, actually the viewership in Age of Empires 4 isn't all that terrible. One thing that does have to be brought into consideration though is not just how much viewership there is, but the spread of viewership. Now, granted, I do think in Age of Empires 4 that there are, of course, you know, certain content creators. I feel like the top content creators, they have the lion's share of viewership, which is the same for any kind of Twitch registry. I do think that there's a lack of spread along the bases, but that's expected for a game that's only been out for, what, 3-4 years. At the same time, a big problem is getting the viewership in. There's one thing having the game, but also having people to watch it regularly. I feel like the viewership on EGCTV is not too terrible, actually. And then that comes to the question of, well, how's the viewership outside of tournaments and official tournament broadcasts? I mean, ultimately, there's the game, but then there's also the actual content creators. I feel like nowadays, you know, the shift towards people watching a game for the game has been really changing towards actually watching content creators for the content creators, the actual people that are making the content. So I don't think it's a reflection of the game as such that it has poor viewership. It might just be the reflection on the content creators. First of all, there aren't that many. And number two, when you think of content creators, the very big ones, there's no secret to how they do it necessarily, or there's no secret to what is common between them. And that's that they are personalities, right? The word influencers come as a reason. They're actually very influential. And the reason why they're influential is because they actually have a following that are dedicated to them specifically, regardless of what game they play or regardless of what they're really doing. I mean, you've got content creators, for example, Beastie and Demu. They're probably the two biggest ones in Age of Empires 4. And ultimately, people who watch those two content creators, myself included, by the way, would watch them play probably any game. Because with their really, I mean, obviously we want to watch a game that we kind of enjoy, but at the same time, it's different when it's them playing it, right? You know, I would selectively choose to watch Beastie QT or Demu just because it's their stream and it's kind of fun to be there. So there's that aspect of it too. I don't think that the link of viewership numbers on a game is just purely on the game quality itself. A lot of it is on the content creators that are within it. And of course, other artist games have had years to bake with that. If you look at, for example, I don't know about StarCraft, to be totally honest with you, but Age of Empires 2, the content creators there, the Viper, Hera, I mean, these guys, again, they could play various games and they'll have a huge viewership on them just because of who they are. They really have built up a massive community that are dedicated to watching them as opposed to just the game. Now, the game, they're obviously there to watch the game, Age of Empires 2 as well, but you know, the Viper and Hera, if they were to switch games, I don't think they'll have a drop in viewership, obviously, but you know, the viewership isn't just there for the game for them. So that goes a big way, I think, to account for the viewership numbers in Age of Empires 4. I don't think it's really necessarily a reflection on the game as much as it is on the reflection on the content creators. Either way, moving on, when you're an aggressive player like me and try to be proactive, make plays, apply pressure, you realize that in most matchups, it's not worth it. The best strategy is to sit on your base and wait for your opponent to crash against you. Eventually, it just becomes incredibly frustrating. Well, the thing is that he's not wrong in a way that in most matchups that actually playing the mid to late game is usually what happens. There are some civilizations like Delhi and that are kind of geared towards actually feud-led aggression or early aggression. But the biggest telling point is that he says eventually it just becomes incredibly frustrating. Now the frustration is probably born out of the fact that it's a playstyle that he doesn't want to do. And it's just the type of game that Age of Empires 4 is. It's not going to be the game where you have 5 minutes of a game and, you know, small differences or small micro differences actually ends up winning you or losing the game. That's just not Age of Empires 4. Then there's the issue of excessive RNG in AoE. I don't like it. I believe that less RNG in an RTS, the better for its competitive integrity. And in AoE 4, there's even more RNG than AoE 2. Sometimes you find 3 sheep, sometimes you find 17. The spawns for gold are all over the place. Some might say, oh, that's good, it makes you adapt. Sure, try adapting when you have 3 golds right next to a Mongol player who puts a tower in between. It's really tough. Now, certainly the RNG levels in Age of Empires 4 are a little bit more than you maybe would want. And he's not wrong there necessarily. RNG, I do feel, can play a role in Age of Empires game, and they always have done really with Age of Empires 2, but maybe Age of Empires 4 has gone a little bit far with that, with especially the gold spawns at times, and they have gone some way to fix that though with the sheep, right? You get a couple of sheep to start off with in the town center, so that helps certainly somewhat. It's a fair criticism, I think, of the RNG aspect of things, but it's not necessarily something that can't be put right. But you know, that's in the future, right? So it's understandable that there would be some frustration there. This isn't the only reason I dislike the game. Everything I've mentioned contributes to why it will never be a big esport. We have to accept that the viewership numbers for Aoe4 are terrible. The Red Bull Wallow online finals had 2,000 viewers. Meanwhile, a game like Warcraft 3, which you might think is dead, actually has more viewers than Aoe4. Warcraft 3 still has an active competitive scene, and even its finals have way more viewers. This is the final of an online circuit, not even a major event. It's just, why isn't Aoe4 taking off? It's because of what I've said. I mean, he's not necessarily wrong about the viewership. It is probably a bit lower with Age of Empires 4 compared to other RTS games, but at the same time you have to remember that Age of Empires 4 is very new. A lot of these RTS games that have been mentioned, like Warcraft 3, they've been out for so long that they've got such a solid backing of viewers that keep on adding on. So then the question you have to ask is, Age of Empires 4 adding new players? And that can be a really good discussion point. So the question everyone asks, is Aoe4 dying? Is it going to die? Relax, the answer is no. Aoe4 won't die, especially because Microsoft won't let any of its Aoe titles die. If Aoe3 is still alive with its DLCs every year or two, and they've even tried reviving Age of Mythology with Retold, which we'll see how it goes, the first few weeks it will probably have a lot of players, then obviously won't let Aoe4 die. This year, I don't know if there will be any new content, so the player base will likely drop, viewership will continue to decline, the competitive scene will shrink, but they release a DLC eventually, maybe next year. Now, there's a few things that is kind of mixed with this, because he's got a good point about Age of Empires 3 being still alive. It's unlikely that Age of Empires 4 would ever die, because of course Microsoft is behind it. And I think there is some fairness to say that it's very difficult to know what's going to be happening in the future with Age of Empires 4, right? We don't know if there's going to be new DLCs, what kind of patch changes there will be, or how often there'll be. It is a bit in the dark with that at times, and it can be very difficult for players in particular to plan ahead. And that's a fair point I think he's making. It goes to be seen really if that changes or not. Who knows whether we will have more of a heads up with what's happening in the pipeline, DLCs and such. But we have often been in the dark about that. Having said all of this, you know, EGCTV has been there for a long time. Well, from the beginning really. Can't really see them dwindling away. And so I don't know if it's just that Age of Empires 4 is struggling or all RTS games are struggling in terms of viewership. I know he's mentioned that Warcraft and the rest of it have slightly more, but there's reasons for that other than just the type of game that it is. It has been there for a very long time. So you accumulate, you know, loyal viewers and loyal fans over time, right? So kind of expect Age of Empires for the viewers to continue expanding unless we feel there's a drain and we actually feel people are actively leaving the game. Which, to be fair, you know, Vortix, Lucifron, moving away to Stormgate, it is a loss of pro player, right? So maybe that will result in some changes, and maybe they're not the only ones that are leaving. They're obviously the two prominent names we know, but I guess there may be some mid-tier players that are leaving as well. Now, about the competitive scene in Aoe4, that's a different story. Actually, it's not that it's going to die, it's already dead. If you look at the prize winnings in the last 8 to 9 months, the best player, Marine Lord, who's by far the best in the game, hasn't even earned 20,000. The best player in the game, of course, the Red Bull Wallow is coming up, and he'll win a good amount there, but Wallow is a one-time event. Last year it didn't even happen. And next year, well, I'm pretty sure there won't be a Wallow. And if there is, I'm convinced it won't be for Aoe4. So when the best player can't even make a living exclusively from tournaments, I mean, again, it's a scenario where it doesn't necessarily mean that the esports scene is dead. It just means that people can't earn a living from it. And then the question you have to ask yourself, well, how many esports scenes are there that can support players, like livelihoods? I mean, with the RTS esports scene. I don't think StarCraft can. I don't think Warcraft can. Or if they can, it's just 1 or 2 players, the top 2 players, right? So I don't think there is... It depends how you define a dead esports scene. For me, an esports scene has got to be able to support a whole ecosystem. Got to be able to support casters, got to support, and I mean professional ones, casters, at least multiple players, like top 10 players, I guess, I think is what really should be what's described as a solid esports scene, right? Because that's 10 players in the world that it can support. I don't think that's asking a lot. So if you put the conditions that, put those conditions over an RTS esports scene, so I'm not sure about this one, because it's not as if Age of Empires 4 is the only scene where they can't, support top players by prize winnings only. I mean, by the way, just prize winnings. There are other ways that you can support yourself. I mean, again, we come back to the top biggest creators in Age of Empires 4, Demu and Beastie. I can't imagine the majority. I don't know the numbers, okay, but it's kind of obvious that their main income is not from esports tournaments. It can't be. It's going to be from their Twitch. It's going to be from their YouTube, the content that they make, sponsorships, teams. Demu part of Team Liquid. I don't know if he gets paid for that. Who knows? But it's all these other aspects that are coming into the play, other than esports directly. The game is competitively dead because there's no incentive for new players. Well, not that there's no interest, but it's impossible for a new player to invest enough time to get good. Say you start today, realize you're pretty good, reach top 20 in the world, and you want to push for top 3, you're going to have to play full time for 4 to 6 months because the current top 3 are all full-time players. And even if you reach top 3, you won't earn enough to live off it. It's simply not viable to be a pro gamer in Aoe4. I don't disagree. I think what he said is spot on. It's almost impossible, I think, to become a pro player at the moment, to be living off it. But that's not specific to Age of Empires 4, I don't think. I think that's specific to all RTS games. I don't think RTS esports is viable if that's your main mode of living. It's there, and you may benefit from it from a year or two, but it's super volatile, and I think it's kind of crazy to hang your hat on that. I genuinely do. It's gonna take balls to think you can make a career out of just esports gaming and live off it. I think you have to do all the other stuff. The content creation, the YouTube, the Twitch side of things, it has to be there. It's completely unfeasible. So yes, Aoe4 is completely dead competitively. The moment that happens in an esport, it's dead. Right now, only 3 people can live off Aoe4, Marinord because he wins all the tournaments and has a big organization backing him, Beastie because he has a huge stream, and Demu, well, because his stream is still big. But thanks to being Demu, not because of Aoe4, his StarCraft 2 stream would be just as big. So I think he's highlighted that, yeah, these guys live off Aoe4 content creation, not from the tournaments, apart from maybe Marinord. But even then, I think if Marinord didn't win tournaments, he still probably would make a lot of money with his content creation. So, but the thing is, if we take that to mean that the Aoe4 esports scene is dead, well then I don't think an esports actually exists for any RTS game, because I think they're all like that. And even his viewership is declining. I think he's talking about Demu there. And I don't know how long he'll keep streaming Aoe4, if he'll switch games or what he'll do. But yes, the reality is that Aoe4 is completely dead. Once this happens, it's over. There isn't even a calendar. We don't know what tournaments are coming up. Well, we know about this one 2v2 tournament with a $3,000 prize pool in September. Obviously, you can see why it's not sustainable. There's no way they are making a profit with this. I don't know how much longer they'll keep it up, but it's impossible for this to be profitable. They're losing money with this approach. So finally, to answer the question of why I've decided to leave Aoe4 now, is because there's no point in competing anymore. It's not even a choice at this point. I stopped competing in Aoe4 because it's simply not possible anymore. The Red Bull Wallow just finished, there's no new tournaments announced, and there's a LAN in America, but it's not like StarCraft 2 where you have the whole year planned out and can decide which tournaments to enter. You're just waiting to see if big organizations decide to keep investing or give up, which looking at the numbers seems likely. I don't know how much longer they'll keep going, but it's impossible for it to be profitable for them. So I had 2 options, keep playing casually or, well, as many of you know, I am an engineer, so I could end up going back to work in my field or try something different in another RTS. It was a coincidence. It was not that I quit Aoe4 for Stormgate. I was going to quit Aoe4 anyway, but Stormgate's early access came out, I decided to give it a shot, and things are going well. My stream has grown considerably, maybe there won't even be tournaments, maybe it won't be viable either, but for now, I'm enjoying it. Aoe4 had become very stale for me. Anyway, I wanted to thank you all again for supporting me throughout my time in Aoe4. It's surprising, or maybe not, that many people from the Aoe4 community were skeptical of Stormgate. They've told me, I'll try it out because of you, I've seen you streaming it, and it looks interesting. They seem to be enjoying it too, so I encourage you all to try it out after December 13th. It should be August 13th, by the way, when it becomes available for everyone. I know most of you are huge AoE fans and probably only care about AoE. Maybe you'll even switch to Age of Mythology, which is fine. I'll try it out too. So obviously best wishes to Vortix. There's lots to talk about there. We've gone through most of it already. A big issue is that I think he's found already success in Stormgate content creation, which is the thing, right? He is focused on streaming Stormgate. And, you know, I think Stormgate, whilst it has been having a lot of hype behind it, I've been super interested in it. I've even got my own channel for it, casting games and whatnot. I mean, the latest stats, there's like 600 concurrent players on Steam. It doesn't look good. So we don't even know how Stormgate's going to go. Ultimately, I think there's something mixed here. There's two issues. There's one about the game that Vortix maybe doesn't necessarily like the game itself. And then there's the aspect of what Age of Empires 4 esports scene is like. I don't think the esports scene for Age of Empires 4 is all that different from many other RTS games. You know, they don't exactly sustain many fewer players than other RTS scenes. I think it's very similar to StarCraft and Warcraft in terms of the number of pro players it sustains. The difference really is in the content creation side of things and the number of content creators and how many people make a living off that. And I think Vortix sounds like he's doing quite well on the Stormgate content creation side of things, so I hope it goes really well for him. But, you know, that's nothing to do with the esports for Stormgate. Hopefully it does go well for him as well on that side of things. I'm a big fan of Vortix. I think we all have been. No reason to... I mean, he's just a likable guy and he's been a great part of the Age of Empires 4 esports scene for a very long time. So best wishes to him. I think he makes a lot of good points in his post and his video. A lot of it I do believe is actually talking about the game itself, and maybe just doesn't like the type of RTS. I don't think necessarily it's a bad thing. It's just the way that Age of Empires is as an RTS game. I think he just has a preference for a different type of RTS game. I do think that the points that he makes for Age of Empires 4 esports scene, however, it's not specific to Aoe4. I think it's very generalizable across the whole RTS scene. And so on that note, what I will say is that this is just one of the two Reddit posts that I wanted to talk about. The second one was from EGCTV, which was, I guess, in a way a response to the post by Vortix, or at least, you know, their take on it, because they were kind of brought into it a little bit. So Aoe4's competitive scene is neither dead nor dying. This is what it is. To start off clearly, this post is not in any way to criticize Vortix's view of the future of Aoe4 esports. He put forward his view, which he is entitled to, and undoubtedly has been one of our esports greats, and a true gentleman, and is entitled to his views on where the esports scene is going. He'll be sorely missed, and we wish him the best. Certainly we all do. That said, as the post is recapping his views has gone somewhat viral on Reddit, I believe it's worth a response. By the way, this is Pesty, I believe. It must be Pesty, right? And so he'd like to offer an alternative outlook on the community from his perspective, covering 4 key areas: the game's watchability, prize money, viewership, and scheduling. So the game's watchability, this is the only issue that he'll not tackle substantially, as it's simply too subjective, which I think is understandable. He does mention, however, that the viewer retention is astronomical and often over 100 minutes. Now, that's obviously because of players when they do watch it, or viewers rather, when they want to watch esports, they stick around, right, for a long period of time. That's a long time, by the way, 100 minutes. That's a huge amount of time to be watching in one sitting. The prize money, there is some nuance required here because there's 2 things true at the same time. Firstly, prize money is not decreasing. Secondly, Vortix is correct that there's a limit to how many fully pro players this scene can realistically support. He mentions that the total prize money in 2023 is 206,000. 2024 at the moment is 120,000, but of course we're not fully through the year. So that's kind of something to bear in mind. He says, I can guarantee that there's more to come, and it's going to be at the very minimum be close between 2023 and 2024. The second thing is that we have seen more and more notable events from non-EGCTV tournament organizers, even when not taking account Red Bull. So specifically King of the Rockies, King of the Northland by Rising Empires, which is a good point, by the way. Rising Empires have come to the fore a little bit, and also the events by Whammon and Steel Series. The third is that we continue to work on major events even through 2024 and 2025, and you can expect to see more major events with significant prize pools going forward. And the thing about this is that EGCTV are a big kind of stakeholder, I guess. They are really prominent in terms of esports. And in all honesty, I think the success of Age of Empires 4 esports does kind of depend on the success of EGCTV at this point. Not a good thing, necessarily, like you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket, but they are doing an incredibly good job. But, and a big but, while in statistical terms the amount of prize money on offer remains robust, Aoe4 is a relatively niche esport and it cannot be supporting a large number of fully professional players. This is a simple and inescapable fact. I believe truly that Aoe4 will continue to do well and retain viewership and players for a long time. More of this is coming, but we are not on the verge of a sudden stratospheric growth as an esport. Now, he mentions that generally calculating exactly how many pro players they can support is around about 1 to 3 players on a fully pro level and another 7 to 10 on semi-pro, which I think is not too bad, all things considered. I don't see many more other RTS scenes doing much better than that, in all honesty. Perhaps at one point we all hoped these numbers would be bigger, but the overriding point that Vortix raises is undoubtedly correct. There is not a lucrative living to be made from very many players in Aoe4. I'll also come back to this in my conclusion. So I don't know what the conclusion will be yet, but I can imagine the conclusion will be that it's the same for, well, any RTS esports. Viewership, this one is more simple. Viewership for EGCTV esports is not decreasing. So there we go. In a nutshell, 2023 our average viewership is 2,377. In 2024 it's over 2,800. So it's actually increasing, if anything. And this doesn't even take into account esports viewership outside of the channel, which is also up, significantly buoyed by Gentlemates streaming some of EGCTV's events, which has led to peaks of 30,000 live concurrent viewerships. So that is pretty huge. Viewership, I guess, doesn't seem like it's dwindling at all, even on Twitch. Now, Pesty does go on to say, however, that viewership for the Red Bull Wololo qualifiers was quite underwhelming. This is something that requires some reflection all around, and many will have their own views on this. That said, it's still noteworthy that the Elite Classic 2, which was only a few months ago, was one of our most viewed events of all time and beat out anything in the last 24 months prior to it. Now, this is actually a really interesting point on the post, and I think it's something that we definitely need to talk about. It's actually a big thing. We've talked about whether the esports scene is dying or whether it's, capable of supporting X number of players. What I would like to mention is the future of Age of Empires for viewership. So whilst the esports scene I don't think necessarily is going to change a huge amount unless one thing happens, and that's that viewership stays the same. The concern I have is that viewership might dwindle, not necessarily because of Age of Empires 4 being particularly a bad game as such, but up to now Age of Empires 4 has been the new kid on the block, the RTS game that's the AAA RTS game that is most recently to have been published, and that is going to change very soon. We've got Stormgate, we've got Tempest Rising, which won't necessarily be an esports sort of thing. We've got Age of Mythology. So plenty of more RTS games coming out very soon that could start to dilute the viewership. They're all great games in and of themselves. It's just that with more games around, more people will find their little niche picks. For example, with Vortix, I mean, he picked Age of Empires 4 because it was probably the most recent game that has a competitive scene. But now that he has options, he's going to slightly tweak his choices based on his preferences, and that's completely understandable. So I am pretty worried about the viewership numbers in the future, especially when you factor in certain content creators who have switched their kind of focus a little bit as well. I'm thinking of the likes of Fitzbro, thinking of the likes of Aussie Drongo. We've lost Age of Noob recently, so plenty of content creators are sort of disappearing from the Age of Empires 4 scene. So I think the viewership might start to suffer. Either way, back on track with Pesty and scheduling. Proper scheduling that is clearly promoted and signaled by Advance has been something significant as an issue for players and viewers alike. My belief is that we can look forward to significant positive changes in this regard, both in terms of how we promote our events, but also a more central level. I believe the hire of Nili as esports coordinator was a very positive move on the end of Microsoft and World's Edge, and I truly believe in him to make the needed changes and more. That is actually pretty huge, I gotta say. That appointment could really revolutionize this aspect of the esports scene. All that said, my conclusion to this might diverge from the build-up, because two things are true at the same time. The first is that there is a strong and compelling case for why Aoe4 esports scene is looking healthy and strong, and it's also true we as a community need to rethink what healthy and strong will look like over the coming years. I believe that our scene is and will continue to be welcoming and exciting one in which players have a strong incentive to become the best. I believe it will continue to be well watched for a relatively niche scene and will continue to see captivating and exciting moments ahead. I believe there continues to be space for some players to make a full-time living from this esports scene and multiple others to make significant part-time incomes. However, we also need to accept that this is not one of the biggest esports in the world, nor will it be. But we are an exciting esports scene that continues to see impressive viewership, and my own belief is that we should accept it and celebrate it for what it is. This may mean on an individual level, the scene might not be able to support everyone's ambitions to the extent we wish it could, which is no fault of theirs, and I hope as a community we can continue to support those that seek other pastures elsewhere and cheer them on. And as for EGCTV, we continue to have a lot of faith in Age of Empires 4 esports and have a big agenda over the next 12 months. You can expect to also see us around some other scenes too. We'll be seeing you all on the screen again sooner than you might think. From Pesty. So overall, some really important and interesting points brought out by Vortix and Pesty. I feel like it really comes down to definitions of what makes an esport. If it's the case that an esport is an esport if it can, manage and actually be able to allow people to make a career and living off of just winning tournaments, then I don't think there's been an RTS esports for quite some time. If, however, you define an esport as being an environment with tournaments in which players can participate and also get involved in the game actively, but also be able to make a living on a wider scale as opposed to just relying on tournament winnings, then I think the esports scene for Age of Empires 4 is doing pretty well and is then more dependent on the viewer numbers overall watching the game and the content creators rather than the tournament winnings per se. Having said all of this, one thing that does bother me a little bit and is a bit concerning is that if it is the second definition and you need viewership, then we wonder whether the viewership will continue to remain the same for Age of Empires 4, considering some of the new changes that are coming in the horizon, which is more choice. More RTS games are coming out, Stormgate, Age of Mythology in particular, and they could start to reduce or at least dilute the viewership that is currently on Age of Empires 4. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Lots to talk about, lots to unpack. Either way, Age of Empires 4 does look like in a really good spot in terms of the actual game itself. Viewership, obviously time will tell, and certainly interesting times. Now, I know this has been a very different type of content than you see on the channel. Let me know if you found it interesting at least, and if not, don't worry, the next video will be a casted game. Take care, and see you next time.